Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we will be discussing the first game of the regular season between the Sharks and the Golden Knights, in which the Sharks lost 4-1. So we haven't actually seen any meaningful Sharks hockey since about mid-May. It's been 4.5 months, and the first game we are greeted with is just a complete disaster for the Sharks, honestly. Even though it's only game one of the regular season, I feel extremely confident in saying this will potentially be the worst game of the season, but at least one of the worst games of the season. And it wasn't looking good just coming into this one. I mean, Shemek was injured, Evander Kane was suspended, Erik Karlsson had to sit out due to a personal reason. So already the Sharks lineup was extremely depleted, plus the fact that it is rather depleted, at least compared to what it was last year, due to the departures of course, Pavelski and Donskoy and Justin Braun, among others. And so they come into this game against the Golden Knights, and instead of the other players still in the lineup playing up to try and fill the void left by these two players having sat out, Kane and Karlsson, instead they sort of just accept that they're not in a very good position and play rather poorly all around. Not that any of these players were horrible. Well, a couple of them were quite bad, but none of the players like Couture and Meier necessarily were horrible. They just basically did not much of anything. So it started off and the Sharks had a good couple of first minutes until the Golden Knights just completely took over, got a couple of goals from Mark Stone, and Riley Smith never relinquished that lead, as while Sorensen made it 2-1, it was a 1-goal lead still for the Golden Knights going into the second period. As the Sharks started off the second period again pretty decently for the first couple of minutes, the Knights get one chance the other way, and it's just another terrible defensive play from the Sharks, and Cody Glass gets his first NHL goal. Thank God we're getting to that early on in the season, and it's 3-1 Golden Knights. Eventually, it looks as though the Sharks again bring it to within one, again at the hands of Marcus Sorensen, but it is reviewed to be a puck that's played with a high stick over the crossbar. It indeed was a stick over the crossbar, and so the Golden Knights took a 2-goal lead instead into the third period. They add to that to make it 4-1 with the Riley Smith 2-on-0 shorthanded goal, and it's a 4-1 victory for them. So the first thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, who by far was the best Shark tonight, even though he did let in 4 goals. If Jones had actually had himself a mediocre or even a bad night, this could have easily been like an 8-1 or 9-1 game. Especially when it was 2-0 Golden Knights, Jones made multiple huge saves where it actually seemed possible at a point, once Sorensen got the goal to cut the lead to 1, it seemed possible at a point that the Sharks could come back just off of the heroics of Jones. Now, it didn't end up being the case, thanks to the way that the Sharks played for the rest of the game, which was very bad, but Jones was still rather impressive, so it doesn't look good on the score sheet, and I'm sure, a few months down the line, we'll look back at this game, see the stats of Jones and say, well, that wasn't a very good game, but in the moment now, it actually was quite solid for him, and if the Sharks can get performances like that out of Jones moving forward, the Sharks should win more games than they lose. Moving on to the lineup, a big question mark from the lineup. Of course, Evander Kane was suspended, Erik Karlsson sat out, but that wasn't really my issue. Through the preseason, the Sharks seemed to have 2 lines that were more or less locked down. Meier, Couture, and Labanc seemed to be the first line the Sharks would head into the season with. In preseason games, we saw that line a couple of times, Meier, Couture, and Labanc. Even when Couture wasn't playing, we saw Meier and Labanc playing together, and so it seemed that would be given a try, but for whatever reason, Labanc was put back to the third line where he was last season, and Taken was moved to the first line instead. Now, of course, Taken was tried a couple of times and seemed to be fitting well with Joe Thornton on the third line. So I'm not entirely sure why Labanc and Taken ended up getting swapped in this game, especially if you're going to try the other way around so much in the preseason. The reason why we have to bear with the preseason for 2 weeks, even though it is incredibly boring for basically all parties involved, is so that the players can not only get up to speed for the regular season, but with usually new line mates, we're after a full off season, you're normally getting with trying to build some new chemistry, and the Sharks seemed on their way exactly doing that, but for whatever reason the Boer decided to go against that and play Labanc back. Certainly there is chemistry on that third line, but you're taken randomly with Meier and Couture. And then also taking a look at the fourth line, it seemed as though Karlsson, Goodrow, and Bergman were basically set in stone as a strong fourth line. They played a lot in the preseason together, but for whatever reason, with Kane's spot being left open, it was Bergman, who was moved up to take the spot on the second line, and Gambrell was put on the fourth line. I do not know why you wouldn't put Redill with Gambrell and Hertl. You actually tried. DeBoer tried at a point Gambrell with Hertl and Kane, so it's not like Gambrell and Hertl have never played with each other. And Bergman, Carlson, Goodrow should be the fourth line moving forward once Kane returns from suspension. So I'm really not sure what DeBoer was planning on doing here with the 12 forward lines. Everything here just basically invalidates what was done in the preseason, making it entirely useless, besides to get back up to speed. And considering how the Sharks played tonight, it didn't even seem like they got back up to speed. So honestly, it was a bad game for the players on the ice, but also a pretty bad game for Peter DeBoer's, lineup making in general, in my opinion. On to the Sharks rookies, as this is probably the first season in a while that had multiple Sharks rookies, starting off 4 of them to be exact. Ferraro, Bergman, Gambrell technically is a rookie, as well as Yurtakin. Now, all 4 of these players were pretty unimpressive. I wouldn't call any of them bad per se, but I was expecting at least something from some of them. Bergman, of course, was shoved onto the second line instead of the fourth line. Maybe he would have had a better performance there, but he was mostly invisible on the second line. Again, maybe Yurtakin would have had a better performance playing with Thornton, the player who he got mostly acclimated with during in the preseason, but Yurtakin was also mostly invisible. Gambrell on the fourth line, he probably looked the best out of the 3 rookie forwards, but still not really doing much. And then Ferraro in the defense, who ended up playing with Heed instead of Prout due to Erik Karlsson sitting out. He was maybe the most active, but you could definitely see some roughness around the edges, as there were a lot of defensive mistakes coming out of Ferraro in this game. He found himself being overzealous on just one too many plays, and so while the preseason looked promising for a couple of these guys like Yurtakin and like Bergman, they weren't that great in this first game. Now, of course, we can hope that that is just a hiccup here and that this isn't a sign moving forward, because if it is a sign moving forward, the Sharks could be in trouble this season. Finally, I will mention a few other players. As I said, some of the players like Meyer and Couture weren't necessarily terrible in this game. They just didn't do much. The players who were terrible in this game, I will point to Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who looked quite rough. So we know he wasn't great last season through the regular season, but he really pulled back in the playoffs. This season, this first game, it has not started off well. Hopefully, it's just a small blip here and Vlasic can get back to knowing what we know out of Vlasic, but it wasn't great. I will say Thornton himself also had a pretty rough game all around, a big minus, found himself caught on the ice for a lot of the Golden Knights goals, and was making some pretty bad defensive plays all around. A player who I was actually somewhat impressed with, surprisingly, was Dalton Prout. Now, he actually had a pretty bad, actually a very bad first few minutes of this game. He made a key mistake on the Golden Knights' second goals, and of course I came into this game with already a pretty strong dislike of Dalton Prout, but I have to say, after the first 10-12 minutes of the first period, he wasn't all that bad, and he actually made a couple of pretty decent plays all around. So hopefully that could be something moving forward. I don't have a lot of hope in Prout, as again in the preseason there really wasn't much to inspire me, but in a game that was filled with a lot of negatives for the Sharks, Prout, past the first few minutes, actually was not one of them. And finally, I will also discuss Brent Burns, who was probably the most active Sharks forward/defender. Maybe you could even make the argument he was the second best player after Martin Jones. I do realize Burns had a very bad play on the Golden Knights' fourth goal that was really the dagger and made it so that the Sharks likely weren't going to come back in that game. But I did like Burns being active in the play. He did at least get an assist on the Sorensen goal. I thought he was probably the Shark who seemed most awake while the others were somewhat sleeping. So I will commend him for that, even if he did make a crucial mistake that really put the Sharks to bed in this one. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday, Game 2 of the regular season, again against the Golden Knights. But thankfully, the Sharks will be at home, as they were on the road in this one, so it'll actually be the home opener of the season. Hopefully, Erik Karlsson, whatever these personal issues, aren't too serious, and he will be back in that game, where hopefully the Sharks will put up a much better performance all around. Class dismissed.